Tonight, mixed messaging. Russian President Vladimir Putin pulls some troops back from the border of Ukraine, muddying the water over when and if the Russian military will invade. Our CBN News team is on the ground in Ukraine. And deal on the line. The blame game over nuclear talks with Iran.
The Biden administration gave the Iranian regime the space it needed.
All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Is the Kremlin about to get what it wants? Good evening and welcome to Faith Nation. I'm Jenna Browder. Tonight, a major capitulation. Germany, one of the most influential members of NATO, signaling an openness to one of Russia's top demands. The German chancellor now willing to formalize Ukraine as a non-member country of NATO. For his part, Russian President Vladimir Putin says he's ready to talk diplomacy. This as the Kremlin announces some Russian troops are pulling back from the border with Ukraine. As CBN's Brody Carter is following the developing story. Brody, the U.S. and NATO both skeptical Russia is actually de-escalating.
That's right, Jenna. The U.S. and its NATO allies taking a wait-and-approach scene. Now, we understand this is the third time in its 2 months that Putin has claimed a diplomatic route is possible. While all along, military drills are ongoing. Thousands of troops still surround Ukraine. President Biden updating Americans on the crisis tonight and the people of Russia, saying we are not enemies, but we will not sacrifice basic principles to appease the Kremlin.
The United States and NATO are not a threat to Russia. Ukraine is not threatening Russia. Neither the U.S. nor NATO have missiles in Ukraine. To the citizens of Russia, you are not our enemy. And I do not believe you want a bloody, destructive war against Ukraine.
It is entirely possible that he could move with little to no warning.
The U.S. is skeptical, and NATO is calling for proof after Russia's defense ministry announced a partial pullback of troops from Ukraine's border. Russian media showing tanks packing up, but giving no specifics of how many troops or which combat positions might be abandoned. Tensions still remain high because regardless of the Kremlin's announcement, military drills are seen and heard over Belarus, just north of Ukraine. The Pentagon warning Putin has added military resources along the border, and NATO Security General urges caution.
Should he choose to invade again, he is doing all the things you would expect him to do to make sure he's ready for that option or options.
So far, we have not seen any de-escalation on the ground, not seen any signs of reduced Russian military presence on the borders of Ukraine.
After Tuesday's meeting in Moscow between German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Putin came word of a possible diplomatic solution. Putin's talking points, limiting missile deployments in Europe and transparency of military drills and other shows of power. That translates to his desire to stop Ukraine and other ex-Soviet nations from joining NATO. After leaving the Kremlin, Scholz told German-speaking reporters he made it clear to Putin that Germany is open to formally keeping Ukraine from joining NATO as a way of averting war. Critics call the chancellor's bold pronunciation in Moscow capitulation to the Russian bear.
Deterrence seems to be working. Vladimir Putin is getting the message.
As lawmakers try to solidify a sanctions package to pressure Putin, some worry moving too soon could cause Russia to retaliate.
It is a serious concern to think that if you impose sanctions, as you put it, that might just harden Putin's position. I think the bottom line really is that Putin is a person who is a megalomaniac, and he just wants the world's attention on him, despite of the fact that he is a multi-billionaire from stealing from his own people.
The United States is closing the U.S. Embassy in Kiev and temporarily relocating any remaining diplomats to the western city of Lviv, which sits on the border of Poland. Jenna, back to you.
And joining us now from Lviv is CBN News senior international correspondent George Thomas. George, great to see you again this evening. So Germany apparently open to formalizing Ukraine's non-membership in NATO as a way of maybe averting war. That is a pretty stark development.
It is, absolutely. Hey, how about asking the Ukrainians how they feel about that? I was talking to somebody today on the streets of Lviv, and they said, listen, we are like a playing field between two superpowers, the United States on one side and Russia on the other side. And they said, this person said to me, how about considering how we think? We're the second largest country in Europe. Does anybody care about what we think? And he said to me at the end of the day, he said, George, this is not about joining NATO. It's not about joining the European Union. It's about freedom. We do not want this gigantic bear known as Russia constantly over us, constantly threatening us, constantly trying to pull us into their orbit. We are an independent nation. We got our independence 30 years ago, and we want to determine, we want the ability to rule by ourselves, govern our future, determine our future. And so to the German chancellor, I'm sure the streets on Ukraine will be saying, hey, how about us? How about we determine that future and whether we want to go east or whether we want to go west? And all indications have been they want to go west, towards the United States, towards Europe, towards freedom and liberty.
Yeah. Russia seems to be saying they're pulling back troops. There's some skepticism there from NATO and the U.S. On the ground there, George, does it feel like that? Does it feel like there's some de-escalation?
You know, I mean, this is the playbook of the Russians. They've done this so many times. We've seen it time and time again. Obviously, the president is probably, you know, he's going to say we need to see evidence of this. You know, the Russian Ministry of Defense said earlier today that they were moving troops out of the western and the southern military districts. The southern military districts is in reference to Crimea, and the western districts is closer to the Ukrainian border. But the United States, along with NATO allies, are going to say, listen, we need to see significant evidence. And obviously, they'll be looking at satellite images, drones, and so forth, to really see if there is a significant pullback from the various sectors that the Russians have now deployed, be it the south, the north, the south, the northeast, the east, as well as the south. The evidence is in is what they're looking for.
Yeah. You know, even with reports of troops leaving overnight, Russian lawmakers gave Putin a political win of sorts, asking to recognize two regions of Ukraine as independent. George, how could Putin use this to further escalate tensions with Ukraine?
Boy, oh boy, talk about another major news event that's taking place right now. The Russian Duma, as you said, which is the equivalent of their parliament, voted to ask President Putin whether he would recognize these two regions that they gobbled up 8 years ago as, in essence, belonging to Ukraine. Belonging to Russia. So here's the question. So are we talking about just the areas that the so-called Russian separatists control, which is half of Donbass as well as Luhansk, or are we talking about the entire region of Donbass and Luhansk, which is controlled by the Ukrainians? And so this, in essence, if Putin does recognize the Duma's passage of this recommendation, it would be significant. I mean, in essence, what it says is that Russia sees these two provinces as belonging to Russia, and in essence puts the Minsk agreement that Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine signed on several years ago basically nil and void. And I can tell you the streets of Ukraine are not going to be happy about this, and they're going to be looking to Ukrainians President Zelensky about what he thinks about this passage. So this just ratchets up the ongoing tension even to another level, because at the end of the day, for Putin, it's about recognizing these two regions as part of Russian territory. And the funny thing is, what Russia wants is that they want representatives from these two regions to be part of the Ukrainian parliament. I mean, which is like absolutely insane. So that, you know, if there is any things about the future of Ukraine, that these two regions which belong to Russia would, in essence, have a say-so. Incredible.
Yeah, incredible indeed. George, I know you've been visiting churches in Ukraine. What are you seeing?
Today, I got a video, Jenna, from just this region. We're talking about the the Donbass region. There is a pastor who lives just a few miles from the Russian forces, from the Russian line. And he and a team of folks got together and they went to this cross that has been there for 30 years, very close. I mean, the Russians can probably see the cross. And they were just praying. They were praying and thanking those who have been praying around the world for Ukraine. But churches I visited this week are on the front lines also spiritually. They have raised, they don't have military weapons and so forth, but they have raised their own weapon, and it's a weapon of prayer, weapon of worship, and they're asking the Lord to do a miracle. You know, there's that famous song, Waymaker. The Lord is the Waymaker. He's the miracle worker, and that's what Ukrainians are praying for, because they know if there is to be an invasion, it would be catastrophic. It would be horrible, as those in the West have described. So the church is active, as I've seen around the world, whether it's Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, Nigeria, all these places that I've been to. The church is always, in the midst of tumultuous times, the church rises and it brings a message of hope, brings a message of peace. And that's what the church does. And that is what the church today in Ukraine is doing.
All right, George Thomas in Lviv, Ukraine. It is so good to have you with us this evening. George, great reporting, and we'll catch up soon. Thank you, George.
Thanks for having me on.
Back here at home, the controversy over mask mandates continues, even as COVID cases drop significantly in the U.S. Hospitalizations and deaths down too. CBN's Tara Merchner has the latest, as some of the states with the strictest COVID restrictions are starting to scale back, with a caveat.
The average number of new coronavirus cases is down some 78% since the highs in mid-January. While that's led to the lifting of mask mandates in many places, the fight is hardly over.
In a much better place than we were a month ago, but we still have to exercise caution.
With the Omicron surge slowing, major employers like Walmart and Tyson Foods are among those easing mask requirements for employees. And despite CDC recommendations to wait, several states are following suit as political winds shift. All but Nevada, however, still require masks in schools.
There are a whole lot more infections when districts are maskless. Schools are unlike most other environments.
Many parents are furious children must remain masked when some adults clearly do not. While fans attending Sunday's Super Bowl were required to wear masks, there were a number of notable exceptions.
We're continuing to keep our children's faces covered while adults, politicians, celebrities all enjoy the Super Bowl game while continuing with this facade of a state of emergency.
Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell also sounding off about it.
Americans who watched the Super Bowl saw rich celebrities having a grand time with hardly a mask in sight. But under Democrats' policies, first graders who watched that big maskless party last night had to wake up this morning and cover their own faces in order to go to school.
Though California is seeing a rapid decline in cases, health officials say they will continue monitoring the situation before making any changes.
There'll be no change in the masking requirement, but on February 28th, full 2 weeks from now, we will reassess the data.
Here in Washington, however, today is the day vaccination requirements to enter businesses end. Its mask requirements in gyms, restaurants, and entertainment venues will go away March 1. In Washington, I'm Tara Merchner, CBN News.
Coming up, the last shot at a nuclear deal with Iran could be fizzling out. What that means for the U.S. and why diplomacy may not be the answer. The so-called final round of negotiations for a new nuclear deal with Iran could be stalling out. The latest report is that Iran National Security Council members say American negotiators seem unwilling to accept Tehran's terms. Two former members of the Trump administration tell CBN News, although the U.S. has lost leverage, it's not too late to get things back on track. CBN News national security correspondent Caitlin Burke has the story.
Officials believe Iran is only weeks away from having enough fuel to build a nuclear weapon, something the Biden administration blames on former President Donald Trump.
Iran's increased capability and capacity, their aggressive actions that they have taken through proxy wars around the world would be happening if the former president had not recklessly pulled out of the nuclear deal.
But Len Khodorkovsky, a former senior advisor to Trump's Iran envoy, says their maximum pressure campaign did exactly what it was meant to.
Iran was down to about $4 billion in cash reserves when the Biden administration came to office. That was the result of the sanctions and the pressure of the maximum pressure campaign. Its proxies around the region were at the weakest point ever, as was the regime.
Khodorkovsky says all that changed was an easing of sanctions after Biden took office,
which sent the wrong signal to the Iranian regime and unleashed their sprint to where they are right now. So the Biden administration gave the Iranian regime the space it needed, the cover it needed to get to where they are and have much, much greater leverage, of which they had really none when the administration started.
While current thinking is that re-entering a nuclear deal is the only way to prevent a nuclear Iran, Khodorkovsky and other former Trump administration officials point to alternative options.
I think the only way to reverse the progress that the Iranian regime has made to date is to turn maximum pressure to excruciating pressure. That will send exactly the right message as to what we will find acceptable.
Eli Kohanim, former deputy special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, says Iran has a track record of cheating on its deals with the U.S., and a diplomatic track may no longer be the answer.
Many voices argue that the United States should actually show a very strong military resolve to the Iranians and let them understand that there are red lines that they cannot cross, and that if the Iranians are not willing to let go of their desire to achieve a nuclear weapons state, that there would be military consequences to that decision-making.
When the U.S. re-entered negotiations with Iran, President Biden promised that a new deal would be longer and stronger than the original. Khodorkovsky calls the deal currently on the table weaker and shorter. Republicans vow that they will block any final agreement if the administration chooses to send it to Congress, but Democrats maintain they won't have the votes. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
When we come back, overdose deaths and millions of relapses. China flooding the U.S. with fentanyl and why some call it an act of war. Overdose deaths and millions of relapses. COVID stimulus checks may have contributed to a surge in drug use, especially fentanyl. The source of the fentanyl flooding into the United States? China. Some say this constitutes an act of war as it destroys America from within. Chuck Holton investigates this crisis in one of the hardest hit areas, Appalachia.
2020 saw a record 92,000 drug overdoses across the United States. And while final 2021 numbers have yet to be released, the total looks to be higher still. The crisis is being driven by the ultra-potent drug fentanyl.
Fentanyl is the most powerful painkiller that's on the market today, and it has a very, very hard effect on the user. It's 100 times more potent than morphine.
Only 2 milligrams of fentanyl can be lethal. In 2021, U.S. Customs and Border Protection seized more than 11,000 pounds of fentanyl in the United States, enough to kill more than 2.5 billion people. Distributors are lacing it with less potent drugs like marijuana, meth, and heroin, often without the knowledge of the user.
It's not just deaths from fentanyl. It's deaths, increasingly, fentanyl mixed with methamphetamines and with cocaine.
We are finding in our drug screening almost every methamphetamine positive also has a fentanyl positive. Once that first high occurs, nothing after that compares.
West Virginia saw a 40% increase in the number of overdose deaths just in 2020 alone, and fentanyl played an increasing part in those 1,200 deaths. But if you talk to experts here in West Virginia, they'll tell you that it's also the U.S. government's response to the pandemic that's to blame.
Unfortunately, the stimulus monies that were distributed throughout the country as a way to address lost income attributed greatly to overdose deaths and to overdose near deaths and millions of relapses. We've seen a significant uptick in clients in the recent months.
This former addict agrees.
I got that big chunk of money. Well, that big chunk of money was gone within days. Sitting at home, being bored, having nothing else to do, already being an addict, you know, hey, let's get high.
But the costs soon became all too real.
Back in November, I lost a very, very dear friend of mine to an overdose. I think that, yeah, the pandemic had a lot to do with it, to be honest.
The source of the fentanyl flooding America's streets might come as a surprise. According to data compiled by the Drug Enforcement Administration, illicit fentanyl is primarily manufactured in China and smuggled into the United States through Mexico. Some say this should constitute an act of war.
Well, we should consider each of those deaths a murder because China wanted Americans dead. China knows exactly what's going on. So when they sell fentanyl, you have to assume that this is Communist Party policy.
These experts fear fentanyl may prove to be our adversary's most powerful weapon, defeating America from the inside out.
Every time someone says fentanyl, we should be saying China. Unfortunately, that's not the case.
If our enemies can destroy our youth who fight our wars, then they've already won the battle.
From Southern West Virginia, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Still ahead, can a stack of pancakes bring an entire community together? You're watching CBN's Faith Nation. Finally tonight, 2 years into the pandemic, people are hungry to connect. One San Francisco man whipped up a sweet and simple idea to meet the need: a neighborhood pancake party. Curtis Kimball came up with an invitation that read in part, "I need to make friends, so I'm making pancakes." A couple of tweets and flyers around the neighborhood later, dozens arrived hungry for breakfast, bringing the kids, dogs, and the rest. In total, about 75 people showed up, and this wasn't just a one-time thing for Kimball. He says he plans to host pancake meetups every couple of weeks across San Francisco. His ultimate hope is that it catches on across the country. And we'll leave it on that note this evening. Thank you so much for joining us for Faith Nation. We'll see you right back here again tomorrow. Have a great night.